It's early morning, July 8th. A hurricane is rampaging through Matagorda Bay and into the Houston area. Over the next several hours, 2.7 million homes and businesses are without power. About 2.3 million of those are CenterPoint Energy customers. As the storm moves inland and weakens, it begins to leave the energy capital of the world without power. Sadly, for the Houstonians, they are about to experience very dangerous temperatures that rise into the high 90s with a heat index of over 100. Hospitals soon become overwhelmed, with patients suffering from heat exhaustion, carbon monoxide poisoning, and the inability to discharge patients due to a lack of electricity in their homes. As the city realizes the gravity of the situation, panic ensues. Most look towards CenterPoint Energy for restoration time or any sort of communication, as a Category 1 hurricane should not cause this amount of damage. Meanwhile, CenterPoint Energy takes a defensive and aggressive stance against criticism. Poor leadership, along with a lack of communication and accountability, plagued CenterPoint Energy as a natural disaster wreaked havoc in Houston. At least 36 individuals from Texas would go on to perish as a result of Hurricane Beryl. 27 of these deaths were in Houston, where CenterPoint Energy controls a monopoly over the metropolitan area. So how exactly did CenterPoint fail Houston? Well, undermining a potential threat to millions was an abysmal leadership decision that should stain CenterPoint Energy's public perception for many years. By taking a toxic defensive stance, it did little to quell concerns that CenterPoint had what it took to has what it takes to continue serving the Houston area's customers moving forward. Unfortunately, CenterPoint controls a monopoly in Houston, where it does not face much pressure to protect its customers' interests by constantly ensuring that they have a well-built infrastructure and leadership. When a company tries to save face while under fire from lawmakers and the public, it showcases an internal problem within the company. Lack of leadership and a lack of accountability, alongside a major lack of communication, left many Houstonians in the dark. Some without being able to make plans to travel or to wait out the heat in the community with no air conditioning in the grueling Texas summer. So, what were some of the issues that plagued CenterPoint during the hurricane? Well, CenterPoint Energy failed to properly stage before the hurricane hit Houston. CenterPoint also lacked a proper outage tracker during the power outage, which led many citizens turning towards the Whataburger app for an estimation of power restoration in areas around Houston. Well, arguably, the most controversial thing the CenterPoint has done is the $800 million investment on 20 large TM 2500 aeroderivative gas turbine generators, which made CenterPoint Energy $30 million off the backs of its ratepayers. Well, these generators were a bad investment since they can't even be used in many scenarios. They're each meant to produce about 35 million watts of electricity, but to actually distribute that power, it's a different story. It typically only serves its use during a large blackout or outage like the 2021 Uri tropical storm, which plagued Houston as well, where there wasn't an issue of transmission, but the actual issue was generation. There wasn't enough power, ironically, in the energy capital of the world to go around. How ridiculous does that sound? Additionally, on top of the inefficiency, the generators take 11 days to assemble. Those $800 million would have better been spent on the infrastructure to actually replace the wooden utility poles with the already existing composite poles from resilient structures, which are still left standing after the hurricane, or some of the concrete poles Houstonians can find in the Montrose area. Some of the more prevalent issues are that CenterPoint was slow to restore power to the Houston area. Over 1 million customers were still without power on Friday, 4 days after the storm had already passed. Additionally, you can look at their poor vegetation management around their utility poles. In some cases, CenterPoint will outright refuse to actually cut down or trim the trees around their poles. Their infrastructure is mostly made out of wooden poles. Can you imagine seeing 1 million poles just outright destroyed if a bigger hurricane were ever to arrive in Houston? Arguably, one of the more prevalent issues that every Houstonian should care about is that CenterPoint will offload the $1 million in restoration costs to its customers over the next 15 years, regardless of their efforts to preemptively strand the grid infrastructure, which were, let's be honest, not much. Although this video has only criticized CenterPoint, we do have to be fair to them. Some of the things that they did to prevent this issue are that CenterPoint actually had a 6-month project started in July 2023 in which it planned to install 46 steel and concrete utility poles to strengthen the power grid resilience in the Montrose neighborhood. Albeit, that really isn't much when you think about it. 46 out of a million poles. Baby steps, they're just a small company. CenterPoint Energy claims to have spent over $35 million on tree removal and trimming in 2023. However, there is no way of knowing where the trees were trimmed or how many were trimmed, as they weren't reported in CenterPoint's report. To be fair towards CenterPoint, they had reached out to 2,500 utility crew members before the storm hit, and then an additional 10,000 more after the hurricane. Some of the things we should scrutinize CenterPoint about are its purchase of the $800 million worth of generators, in which they leased and made a $3 million profit off the backs of its ratepayers or customers. These generators haven't even been deployed once during an emergency, and they are not reliably mobile. These generators should have been small and portable in order to be loaned out to hospitals, vulnerable locations, and populations, as well as cooling centers. However, CenterPoint dropped the ball here. Additionally, CenterPoint greatly underestimated the impact of the hurricane, as they probably had a wrong analysis of where the path of the hurricane would be. They failed to properly stage beforehand a hurricane, which is simply terrible leadership. It's quite frankly stupid to not stage before a hurricane. That's just the dumbest thing to do, especially when their infrastructure has constantly not been up to par. What's the point of having generators to help in generating electricity if the problem with the infrastructure is the transmission or the distribution of the electricity, since their infrastructure is not able to withstand high winds with the measly wind utility poles? Additionally, we can scrutinize them about the slow restoration, as it took over 10 days to restore power to most customers, in the excruciating heat and humidity, which is just grounds for mold and heat exhaustion. And let's be honest, nobody really wants to deal with those things in Houston. Some homes and businesses were still without power over a month after Hurricane Beryl had already left, including Jambiet Kitchen, which is a popular sit-down restaurant and bar on Westheimer. The business had to borrow a generator to bring in needed cash inflow for its employees and business expenses. I set down a GoFundMe in the description, in which they have set up for their funds. If anybody's interested, it'll be down in the description. It's a good restaurant also, so go out and support them. So what exactly is CenterPoint planning on doing? Well, for starters, surprise, CenterPoint will charge its customers for the next 15 years on an increase towards their monthly bills. Well, in August, CenterPoint Energy unveiled its Greater Houston Resiliency Initiative, with claims that they are committing to building the most resilient coastal grid in the country. Yeah, I'm not really sure if they believe that one themselves. Yes, the company that is prone to blackouts and power outages in recent times is repeating the same message they have been blabbering about for the past 10 years. Well, these claims will fall on deaf ears and empty pocketbooks as Houstonians continue to suffer through rate increases with little to no improvement to the grid. Moving on to the details of the action plan. The most questionable one should be the visual inspection of all overhead distribution circuits that were impacted during a hurricane. Well, inspecting is one thing, not fixing the issue is another. Here are some photos of a property in Waller, Texas, where CenterPoint conducts business in. Apologies for the quality, I'm not the best photographer, but as you can see, these branches are growing onto the power lines, and trees can conduct electricity, making the street an area a hazard. There are many other cases in which the scenario can be encountered all throughout Houston. In some cases, CenterPoint refuses to outright trim the vegetation, claiming it is the homeowner's responsibility. 1,000 wooden poles will be replaced by composite fiberglass poles, which is less than 1% of over 1 million poles in the Houston area. Each pole is about 5,000, so a bit more than 5, which begs to question, where has the $1.46 billion spent on the past 5 years to improve the infrastructure? Where is it? I don't know. I guess CenterPoint doesn't really know either, as you know, the lawmakers keep asking them, where's that money actually going? And they just say, well, the infrastructure. But what exactly does that even mean? Additionally, this plan also calls for an estimated $376 million to harden this transmission system from 2025 to 2027. What the transmission? Well, that's the utility poles, the transformers, the lines. Well, even if all that money was used to replace the wooden poles, that will only equate to about 7 to 8% of all poles in Houston. Hardly anything for 2 years. These commitments are too little to effectively make a significant change in which they continue to promise. The plan also calls for an additional $1.45 billion spent during the 2025 year improvements to the infrastructure. Again, with the infrastructure that just keeps underperforming with the billions of dollars supposedly being spent on. It's a shocker how this is allowed. Why is CenterPoint constantly claiming to improve the infrastructure when the real issue is this transmission or the distribution of power due to the down or destroyed utility poles? While yes, transformers are important to upkeep and improve, these wooden poles do not belong in a hurricane-prone area anymore. It's just unacceptable to have these. This should really upgrade. According to CenterPoint, they have developed an expanded staging site housing for 4 locations to decrease the travel time for out-of-state and out-of-city linemen. I guess this is the first positive change we've seen so far. Shout out to the linemen. They're the actual heroes of this crisis. CenterPoint increases short-term lease of mobile generators from 4 to 13 generators up to 1 million watts. It's an okay start, I guess. There's not really much to go based on that. Now, the big thing is the 10 backup generators that CenterPoint will donate to facilities across communities with coordination from local leadership. What remains to be seen, however, is where these generator facilities will be located. Hopefully to lower income areas and critical health areas where elderly people might live, as they are most at risk from long-term outages in the heat. The sites will be located by September 30th, 2024, and the generators will be distributed by June 1st, 2025. That is a long estimation. I'm not really sure why, but it's a small positive and a very long list of negatives. So shout out to CenterPoint, I guess. Now for one of the funniest and biggest updates. Every Houstonian won it during the outage, but had to turn towards Waterbury to receive updates. An updated cloud-based restoration map is going to be able to handle massive traffic. You'll be able to enter zip codes, streets, and by far the boldest take so far. Have a restoration time for 100% of affected customers given 24 hours have passed after a storm. That is a very large take that they're taking. So what should a city of Houston and Texas demand? Well, State Senator Paul Bettencourt, a Republican from Houston, suggests that lawmakers consider whether Texas should recoup a portion of the $800 million CenterPoint spent on generators that weren't used during the storm. Bettencourt continued by saying the CenterPoint is defrauding customers by spending money on generators and asked them where they make a profit instead of vegetation and power line concerns. Additionally, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has advocated to the Public Utilities Commission that CenterPoint must pay for the generators from their own profits. Some of the things that, well, the Houston should demand are updated wooden utility poles to updating the poles to a stronger material that can withstand high wind, and in the cases where feasible, bury the power lines. Yes, I know it's expensive, but there are some areas in Houston where it's possible and feasible, and honestly the best option to bury the power lines. A stronger method of communication between CenterPoint and its customers, including a working restoration map, updates to the infrastructure such as composite fiberglass poles or concrete poles. The City Public Utilities Commission and the Lieutenant Governor should fight to recoup the cost of the $800 million generators, which allowed CenterPoint to profit $30 million at the cost of its ratepayers. City of Houston should demand a complete removal of wooden utility poles within 10 to 15 years. Largely, it doesn't make sense to not have better poles. Having to replace these poles after every single storm, even thunderstorms, it's just the dumbest thing ever to continue to allow CenterPoint to raise rates for the restoration costs. How about preemptively reducing these costs through actual investments instead of cheap band-aids that do more harm than good? The City of Houston should also demand some accountability from Jason P. Wells, the CEO of CenterPoint. He claims he takes full responsibility, but he has not done much to shoulder those words. If his bonus incentives were based on prolonged outages, he'd be the next Steve Jobs, bringing innovation, but in his case, it's his direct contribution towards one of the country's most unreliable grids. If CenterPoint continues to drop the ball, stronger regulations should accompany a monopoly, as it is too important of a company to constantly fail the energy capital of the world. So what can be done? What's the call to action here? For the more practical and feasible solutions, CenterPoint should replace these poles with concrete reinforced with steel, or the composite fiberglass poles that they already have from resilient structures. Additionally, it's smarter to get these poles from resilient structures since they are building a factory around Houston. The population would benefit by focused attention to highly populated areas and areas that are susceptible to flooding. It's in the best interest of CenterPoint to develop the infrastructure in these areas for when storms cause damage, so that they can allow for a quicker restoration of power on a much larger scale, then they can focus on larger populations and then go from there. Additionally, bonds should not be used for future improvements to the infrastructure, as this would just increase the ratepayers' total payments through interest. Instead, CenterPoint should aim to increase these rates slightly but throughout a larger period of time in order to not burden customers as much, preferably over 20 years, as these steel poles and steel and concrete or fiberglass poles could last longer. Additionally, CenterPoint should look to establish these poles as they require far less maintenance and are suitable for extreme weather such as hurricanes. Some downsides are that they are an eyesore to the public, but Houstonians should be able to compromise, as this would overall be an improvement, albeit not aesthetically pleasant as Montrose residents have discovered recently. The other alternative to wooden utility poles are the composite utility poles, which are able to withstand hurricane-force winds. Some companies that offer these are Trident Industries and Resilient Structures, which are opening a factory in Houston and already have one around the city. The downside to these poles are the upfront larger costs. However, some of those costs can be recouped due to the weight being less than concrete and wood poles. Additionally, no maintenance is needed after these poles are installed, other than standard vegetation around the power lines and a visual inspection every now and then. These composite poles are immune to rot, pest, rust, and are non-conductive, which is a huge plus as it makes it safer for linemen. Trident Industries offers a 40-year warranty and estimates that these poles can last upwards of 80 years, which is better than the alternative of wooden poles in which they have to replace every couple of years or so, as they are prone to rot. Well, these poles are also made to bend and flex during high winds without breaking, which is the strongest selling point for them. Some evidence that these concrete poles might work can be pointed towards this Wesker Labs map up during the outage, where you can see below the U in Houston. It's the Montrose area, or it's next to River Oaks. It appears that around the peak of the storm, the outages were not as bad as other areas due to these concrete poles that they built in 2023. Additionally, Resilient Structure claims that their composite poles are still left standing after the storm, most notably around Baytown. Some composite poles that could still be seen standing were around Baytown, and those are the fiberglass poles that they're focusing on bringing towards Houston. As Houston continues to recover from the hurricane, one can only hope that CenterPoint will finally learn after its constant mistakes and effectively develop the infrastructure and transmission system to continue its place as one of the most important cities in Texas. Also, shout out to the linemen from many other cities and states that have helped clean up the mess from CenterPoint's lack of leadership. And here's to a stronger Houston.